Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and I am so pleased you've joined me for today's show. A special shout out to all of you in Vancouver and Toronto listening across Canada. Thank you so much for your support. So, today we're breaking down the most frustrating locations as a landlord to own and operate rentals in Canada. From restrictive rent laws to long eviction times and steep property taxes, some places up north make it tough to turn a profit. And if you're thinking of investing and you already own property in one of these areas, this episode will help you understand what you're up against and what to watch out for. So let's dive in. Okay, so first, let's define what we mean by landlord unfriendly, right? This is the top 5 locations that are least friendly to landlords. Generally, we're talking about places with policies that tilt in favor of tenants at nearly every step, but not always. Sometimes this includes stricter rent controls or caps on rent increases, including proper notice timing for rent increases. This could also include long eviction procedures, strong tenant protections, including landlord retaliation, not only defined, but also timing. Tight limits on late fees or rent collection is also included, narrow windows for returning security deposits, and big penalties for missing them. Some locations also have complex licensing or inspection requirements, but those aren't the only items when you own and operate rentals in these locations. There are other considerations like cash flow items such as property taxes, insurance costs, even things like access to tenant qualification items, including public online criminal records check, even for a fee, pre-made forms, including pre-made leases or warning letters. And it's not that all these laws are always bad. They often aim to protect housing affordability, but they do add risk and cost for small landlords. So let's talk about the least landlord-friendly locations in Canada. Canada has some of the world's strongest tenant protections and rent regulations, and especially in provinces like Ontario and British Columbia, but there's others that aren't too friendly either. Let's start at the 5th spot. Number 5, Prince Edward Island. Now, if you've missed it, I did do a location specific episode, episode 192 on PEI. PEI is considered one of the least landlord friendly provinces because it combines tight rent control, strong procedural protection for tenants, strict limits on fees and deposits, and detailed compliance requirements that create high risk if a landlord makes mistakes. So let's talk about the strict rent roll with limited flexibility out there in Prince Edward Island. PEI has formal rent control. Landlords can only increase rent once every 12 months and must give 3 months written notice for the annual allowable rent increase. Now, that by itself is not what makes this landlord unfriendly. We'll get to that in a minute. Likewise, the province sets a maximum allowable percentage increase each year, and they're not the only ones. If you want to go above the maximum allowable rent increase, for example, to catch up low rents to market, then you must apply and justify it. And landlord groups complain that the system makes it hard to reach fair market rent. Importantly, the once every 12 months rule applies even if the tenant changes within that period, which blocks the classic landlord strategy of resetting rent to market every turnover. Did you get that? Rent is tied to the unit, not the tenant. This one is the deal breaker for me. PEI's Residential Tenancy Act is explicitly framed around preserving tenancies and tenant quiet enjoyment, which is not a bad thing. Landlords must follow strict notice, form, and timing rules to terminate. Personal use or owner move-in and renovation type terminations are tightly regulated, with members of legislative assemblies, MLAs, and landlord advocates publicly arguing that it is too hard and too slow to remove problem tenants or to repurpose units. That can be a problem for sure. Self-help options are essentially banned in PEI. Landlords cannot change locks, cut services, or interfere with tenants' access to property as leverage. Or interfere with tenants' access or property as leverage or rent or behavior, even if rent is late. That's pretty normal. I call that being a good human. That's not necessarily just a PEI thing. But the PEI Residential Tenancy Act also narrowly limits what deposits a landlord can collect and explicitly forbids any deposits other than what is allowable in the statute. Taking extra money just in case is illegal. Again, none of this is specific to PEI per se. This is just how they do it, but other provinces do the same thing. Further, the Act also prohibits various additional or junk fees during the tenancy and prescribes how rent is to be paid and receipted, leaving little room for flexible late fee structure or creative incentives. And because you cannot freely use large damage deposit or aggressive late fees at risk management tools, you can carry more downside from property damage or chronic late payers. But again, some of this is best practices. You get what you tolerate. All right, we'll continue on PEI. All residential tenancy agreements in PEI must be in writing and must follow statutory requirements. Using an informal or non-compliant lease can put clauses at risk and weaken your position in disputes. The Act further lays out formal requirements for what a lease must contain, including prior rent, contact information, detailed terms, which increases the chance that a technical error can be used against the landlord. Move-in condition inspections and written reports are required, and the landlord has to offer at least 2 reasonable opportunities for inspection and complete a specific type of condition report. Failing to do this can properly undermine later damage claims, which makes sense. Basically, if you don't do a move-in inspection, then you can't withhold anything at the end from the damage, the security deposit. Further, tenant have codified rights to quiet enjoyment, including reasonable privacy, freedom of unreasonable disturbance, and secure to access to common areas, and the landlord's right to enter is tightly restricted, usually requiring written notice at least 24 hours in advance, except in emergencies. Landlords are also barred from terminating or restricting essential services and facilities such as heat and utilities as leverage, and must maintain habitability and services throughout the tenancy. Tenant rights organizations on PEI actively frame the Act as primarily a tenant protection instrument and push back on the changes that would materially shift power to landlords, which keeps the legal and political climate tilted towards renters. Again, if you want to see all the numbers and nitty gritty about PEI, episode 192, and this is really the biggest problem I see with PEI is that the market rent, that the rent amount is not tied to the tenant, it's tied to the unit. So when the tenants change, you actually have to declare what the rent amount is for that unit for that time frame. And so you cannot step it up in between. This one is a big, big deal breaker for me. Everything else is pretty standard. There's nothing to, keeping a unit habitable, proper use, proper notice, all that stuff doesn't make it landlord unfriendly. In fact, that just makes it business type as far as I'm concerned. But the whole trick of once every 12 months, the rule applies even if the tenant changes, that for me is the deal breaker. All right, let's move on to number 4. Number 4, province of Manitoba. Now, I did do a location specific episode 131. So if you are interested in listening, either you've got rentals there or you're thinking of getting rentals in Manitoba, go back and take a look. Episode 131 is a dedicated episode for this location. Manitoba is smaller and less discussed than Ontario or BC, but it still falls on the less landlord-friendly side of the spectrum because of formal rent control and tenant-focused regulatory approach. The province enforces annual limits on rent increases for most existing tenancies, similar in spirit to Ontario and BC, and landlords must follow specific notice rules when raising rent. On paper, Manitoba's controls can even be stricter than Ontario's, which is surprising, with rules intended to prevent large increases between tenancies, though enforcement has historically been uneven. Now, if you're a landlord in Manitoba and you've gone through this, I want to hear from you. For a landlord, the practical implication is that you cannot count on rapid rent growth to bail out poor underwriting, especially if you're in the multifamily space. Cash flow improvements are gradual and require disciplined expense management, which is true for any location, not just Manitoba. Evictions in Manitoba are overseen by the Residential Tenancies Branch and the Residential Tenancies Commission, which is a different body, which provide a structured but tenant protective dispute resolution system. Non-payment and breach cases require proper notices, adherence to timelines, applications to the branch, where tenants can raise defenses related to maintenance, harassment, and procedural defects. And while Manitoba may not be as backlogged as Ontario, Manitoba landlords still report that the process can take time and that the decision makers are sensitive to power imbalances between landlords and tenant. As a result, you, as the landlord, must treat documentation, including payment history, maintenance records, copies of notices, as essential evidence rather than optional paperwork. Remember, if it wasn't written, it didn't happen. Regarding deposits, Manitoba technically has tight rules that, in theory, prohibit rent increases between tenancies beyond regulated amounts, and the security deposits are capped and heavily regulated. You must return deposits within defined timelines and provide clear itemization of any deductions. Failure to follow procedure can expose you to orders to repay the deposit and, in some cases, additional penalties. There are also limits on late fees and other ancillary charges, so you cannot freely fee your way out of risk from chronically late tenants. The province maintains strong habitability standards and grants tenants clear complaint channels, increasing your obligation to address repairs quickly, which you should do anyway. From an operating standpoint, Manitoba is not as expensive as British Columbia or Ontario's largest markets, but expenses still matter because rent growth is constrained. Property taxes vary by municipality but can be meaningful. Insurance and heating, particularly in cold winters, must be factored into your pro forma calculations. Tenant screening tools such as credit checks and employment verification remain available, yet human rights legislation limits discriminatory practices, and smaller markets sometimes mean a thinner applicant pool. Combined with the province's regulatory stance, this environment rewards landlords who prioritize stable, long-term tenancies, high-quality maintenance, and conservative financing rather than aggressive turnover strategies. Manitoba may not be as famously challenging as Ontario or BC, but its rent control, formal dispute resolution system, and strict treatment of deposits still place it clearly on the least landlord-friendly side of the Canadian spectrum. Investors who enter either with realistic expectations about rent growth and timelines for resolving problems are far better positioned than those assuming US style flexibility. Now, again, if you're interested in the Manitoba location specific episode, go to episode 131. And just one quick note, as you can hear as I read through the Manitoba aspect on least landlord friendly criteria, it's sort of balanced. It's in between. So there are some aspects that make it least landlord friendly. Okay, but let's move on. Number 3, Quebec, especially Montreal. Now, this one is in episode 168. I did do a location specific episode there, 168. Quebec is often described as highly protective of tenants, and many investors classify it as one of the least flexible provinces for landlords, especially around rent increases and evictions. The province of Quebec has long-standing rent control mechanisms through the Tribunal Administratif du Languedoc, I messed that up, TAL, which can set or review rents, particularly when the tenant challenge increases. In practice, an annual rent increase expectations are modest compared with potential rises in comparable expenses, including taxes, insurance, and the utility, especially in Montreal and other large cities. While you sometimes can adjust rents more aggressively on turnover, tenants have avenues to contest spikes, and the legal framework strongly encourages stability for long-term occupants. Evictions are tightly regulated and often slow in Quebec. Most tenancies can only be terminated for specific causes such as non-payment, serious breach, or very limited landlord use grounds. The TAL oversees disputes in a formal process. Tenants can raise condition issues, repairs, or alleged harassment as defenses or counterclaims, and procedural missteps by the landlord can step the process back significantly. Quote unquote family move-in and owner occupation evictions are possible, but they must follow strict rules and can be closely scrutinized, particularly in the common plex housing type where multi-unit buildings are owned by small investors. In some cases, compensation and relocation support may be required, and bad faith terminations can lead to financial penalties. Further, Quebec has a 3-year moratorium on renovation evictions, where you're going to displace someone by ending their tenancy so you can renovate their unit. They just straight up don't want that done for 3 years until 2027. That makes it sort of landlord unfriendly for sure. But Quebec's rules on deposits and fees are also restrictive. Security deposits are far more limited than in many jurisdictions. There is no broad equivalent to the damage deposit systems familiar elsewhere in North America, which leaves landlords bearing more risk for unit condition at move out. Rent is often paid on a fixed schedule with limited ability to impose substantial late fees. Attempts to layer in aggressive fee structures can run afoul in consumer protection or tenancy rules. At the same time, landlords must maintain properties in good repair and ensure habitability. Tenants can seek reductions in rent or orders compelling repairs if conditions fall below legal standards. Culturally and administratively, Quebec's system expects landlords to be sophisticated and highly compliant. Basically, they expect you to be a good human. The legal process, documentation, and many official resources operate primarily in French, which can be an additional barrier to non-francophone investors. Property taxes, particularly in major urban areas, can be significant, and older housing stock can drive high maintenance and capital expenditures. Screening tenants is possible via credit checks and references, but human rights law restrict discriminatory criteria, and in practice, vacancy pressures in cities like Montreal give tenants leverage in negotiations. Combined with fixed moving dates, customs typically around July 1. The entire city of Montreal move on July 1 every year. It's the weirdest thing, but that's what they do. But this is also promotes strong tenant protection policies. Quebec is generally a province where operational skill and patience matter more than brute force rent growth. For landlords seeking maximum control over rent and fast removals of problem tenants, Quebec is usually not the first choice, especially if you're trying to do a rent eviction, which there, like I said, there's a moratorium. Those who succeed here are typically lean into long-term and stable tenancy strategies, meticulous legal compliance, and conservative underwriting that assumes modest annual rent increases and slower resolution of disputes. Holy moly. Wow, did you catch all that? Quebec. Episode 168, I go in a lot deeper dive of all the numbers and details of what's going on in Quebec. But Quebec is number 3 on the least landlord-friendly location in Canada. But let's get to number 2. British Columbia, especially Vancouver. Now, I did do a landlord location-specific episode 122 on this. And of course, I have rentals in BC, so this hits very close to home. British Columbia is another province that many landlords place near the bottom of the landlord friendliness scale in Canada because it pairs strong tenant protections with high operating costs and intense political focus on housing. Like Ontario, BC uses annual rent increase limits for most existing tenancies. Landlords can only increase rent once every 12 months for a sitting tenant, and the percentage is capped by a provincial guideline. In a market like Vancouver, where property values, taxes, and insurance have surged, those caps can lag well behind actual costs, eroding margins over time. While landlords can reset rent to market rates between tenancies, renovictions or demo evictions, which is the name of trying to displace a tenant so that you can renovate or demolish a unit, are very heavily scrutinized, and new rules constrain using renovictions as a pretext to displace tenants. The eviction process in BC runs through the residential tenancy branch, and I call them every once in a while. They handle disputes administratively rather than through the traditional courts. On paper, this should be efficient, but in practice, landlords often face significant delays in scheduling hearings, especially in high-demand urban areas. Tenants can contest notices for non-payment, alleged breaches, or landlord's use of property, and hearing officers examine evidence closely with strong attention to whether the landlord complied with repair and maintenance obligations, quote-unquote just cause requirements, anti-retaliation protections, and the possibility of tenant claims for wrongful eviction or bad faith owner move-ins all increase your procedural and financial risk. In terms of fees and deposits, BC allows security deposits but caps them tightly, typically at a half month's rent plus an additional half month for a pet damage deposit also is capped. You must follow strict move-in and move-out condition inspection requirements and return deposits within a set time frame, or formally apply to keep the funds. Failure to do this correctly can force you to refund the entire deposit, even if there was real damage. Late fee amounts are limited, and you cannot use punitive fee structures to compensate for chronic late payers. Habitability rules are robust in BC. Tenants have clear rights to safe, well-maintained housing, and they can seek rent reductions or order requiring repairs if you fall short. BC's cost structure compounds these legal constraints. Vancouver, and Victoria are among the most expensive rental markets in the country, with low vacancy rates and very high purchase prices. Property taxes and insurance, particularly for strata or older buildings. By the way, strata is another word for either homeowners association for my US friends, or if you are in Australia, it's a corporate body, but a strata is what they call it in Canada. Property taxes and insurance for particularly for strata and older buildings. Utilities can all be substantial increases, and compliance with local building, fire, and energy codes can require ongoing capital investment. On top of this, municipalities may require business licenses, rental unit registration, and participation in local inspection schemes, all of which increase administrative load. Landlords can use credit reports, employment verification, and references for screening, but BC also enforces privacy and human rights rules that limit discriminatory data. And there are active tenant advocacy networks that encourage renters to challenge perceived unfair treatment. For landlords, BC can still be profitable due to high demand and strong rents, but the legal structure forces you to treat tenancy law, documentation, and maintenance as mission critical disciplines rather than afterthoughts. That's true. Long-term success usually depends on very conservative leverage, professional management, and a clear understanding that rent is not always keeping up with rising expenses. BC is an interesting place to have rentals. That's episode 122 if you want all the digits, all the info on the exact bits and pieces. So let's talk about the number one least landlord-friendly location in Canada, Ontario, especially Toronto. Now, I did do a location-specific episode 124. So if you want to know the actual data on that, go to that episode. But if you're a landlord in Ontario, you're operating in what many investors view as the most tenant-friendly province in Canada and one of the most difficult for small landlords. Ontario has strict rent control for most of the units built before November 2018. The province sets an annual guideline. As of 2024, the maximum increase is 2.5% annually for sitting tenants, even if inflation or your expenses rise more quickly, and they likely will. That means for property taxes, insurance, utilities, maintenance can jump faster than your rent, and of course your mortgage is in there, but they can't say that. Squeezing cash flow over time. Units built after the cutoff date are exempt from this guideline, but political risk is real. Rules can and often will change, and large increases can draw media and tenant advocacy attention. Evictions in Ontario go through the Landlord and Tenant Board LTB, which has become synonymous with delay and backlog. For non-payment or substantial breach, you must serve precise forms, wait the required notice period, and then file with the LTB. Even straightforward non-payment cases can take months to reach hearing and longer to obtain an enforceable order, especially in larger cities due to the backlog. Tenants frequently raise issues like repairs, maintenance, and alleged retaliation as defenses or counter applications, which can slow things further and expose you to monetary orders if the board finds you that have failed to maintain the property. Ontario's no-fault eviction routes, like an owner move-in or major renovation, are tightly regulated and often require compensation to the tenant, strict timelines, and proof that you actually did what you claimed, and prove that they had to move out. On the fee and deposit side, Ontario law is very restricted. You cannot charge a traditional security deposit. The only deposit allowed is for last month's rent, and it cannot be used for damage. That means that you carry more risk on damages and cleaning, especially with short-term or marginal tenants. Late fee practices are constrained, and while you can incent on-time payment in limited ways, aggressive late fee structure that compensate for risks are not permitted. At the same time, Ontario enforces strong habitability and repair obligations, and tenants have clear avenues to force repairs or seek rent abatements if you fall behind. Operationally, Ontario is highly standardized and regulated. There is a mandatory standard lease form, and failing to use it properly can give tenants leverage to challenge terms or seek remedies. Municipalities such as Toronto have additional inspection and apartment safety programs that may require registration, periodic checks, and adherence to local standards, adding both administrative overhead and cost. Property taxes in many cities are substantial, especially as assessments rise, as well as rates typically. Property taxes are substantial, and insurance premiums have and continue to climb, particularly in older multifamily stock. On tenant screening, you can still use credit checks, references, and employment verification, but human rights and privacy rules, once again, limit the kinds of questions you can ask and the basis on which you can refuse a applicant. You cannot enforce no pets clauses in most residential leases, which reduces your discretion in that area. For a landlord used to a US red state rules, Ontario can feel like the polar opposite. Controlled rent growth, slow and formal eviction processes, no damage deposits, and strong enforcement of tenant rights. Investors who do well here generally assume conservative rent growth and budget for legal and LTB delays, keep meticulous maintenance records, and rely on very strict upfront screening within the bounds of human rights law. The no security deposit is a big deal breaker for me on this one. So there you have it. What unites all these markets? A strong emphasis on tenant protection and housing affordability goals. And while these rules can protect renters, they can also discourage investment and shrink supply, which is bad because now there's a housing shortage. Eventually, this pushes up rents even higher in the long run. Smart landlords adjust strategies, screen carefully, keep good tenant relationships, maintain properties well, maintain written records, and understand local laws before investing. So, which markets are the toughest? Ontario, British Columbia, they stand out for sure. They're challenging but not impossible. I know because I'm doing it now with BC Rentals. And today's episode is starting a series of 4 episodes on the top 5 best and worst locations for landlords in both the US and Canada. And spoiler alert, at least one of today's Canadian provinces that are in the least landlord-friendly list are also in the most landlord-friendly list. What? Successful landlords in these regions stay informed, stay compliant, and stay patient. Now, wherever your rentals are, make sure you're staying current with the latest tenancy laws. Laws can and will change, so either you need to keep educated or you need to pay someone like a property manager or local real estate attorney to help you. I'm happy to guide you through podcasts like these and my location-specific episodes, but as a rental owner, you still have to do some of the heavy lifting. I hope you enjoyed today's show with me, top 5 most frustrating places to landlord in Canada, with a few honorable mentions thrown in there. Thanks for listening. If you found this episode helpful, consider sharing it with another landlord, another tenant, another investor, or leaving a comment or review. We're recording this episode today in San Antonio, Texas. Why? Because Michael has some medical appointments. That's why. But because real estate takes you places, where do you want real estate to take you? Join me next week for episode 210, where we do the same episode south of the border with the top 5 least landlord-friendly U.S. states with some honorable mentions there as well. I'll see you there.